All right, so welcome to the grid. This is one of the coolest things that's come along on CSS in a long time. It's still not 100% supported by all browsers, so this is why it's new to the curriculum. It's close enough that within the next couple of years, it's going to be everywhere. And it's already, when it first was launched, it already was accepted by the major browsers right away. They had a lot of feedback and input on the creation of it. And so it's really well supported overall, but it's not fully 100% supported. So here's a basic idea. This is all the theoretical stuff, then we'll look at some actual code. The basic idea is this. You will actually be creating an imaginary grid, if you will, in CSS. This grid only exists in your mind. It's not even a real thing. It's just a thing that you're able to sort of use as a model to figure out where you want to lay stuff out, okay? So this is, well, we'll call this the one grid. It's a 4x4 grid. And let's get some basic terminology out of the way. First of all, we call these what you'd think we call them, rows, right? We call these what you think we call them, columns. And what about these? Cells, yeah, just like in Excel here, right? So rows, columns, and cells. You'll also hear another name for rows and columns, which is track, T-R-A-C-K, and it kind of makes sense, right? This is a track here, right? This is a track, that's a track, okay? The other thing that you need to get familiar with, and this is not hard, but it's one of the trickier things, is the lines. So this grid here, again, this grid will never be drawn anywhere. You'll never see it. But it's a model in your head that you can write code to design stuff and lay stuff out. So we have what we call lines here, and this is a line right here, right? That's one line. There's another line. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious where the lines are, right? So if there's 4 rows, there's going to be 5 lines because you have the one at the beginning and the end, right? And there's also the same thing with when it comes to columns and rows. They both have these lines. We're going to write code that specifically targets these lines to help us to style our layout here, okay? The other thing, if you take a look over here on this one here, it's kind of hard to see there, but you can kind of tell there's a little bit of a space in between the grid lines. You see that? You can actually apply what's called a grid gap to your grid. And again, I'm going to show you all this in the code in just a minute. But you can apply a grid gap, which will give a spacing like this. The basic idea of the grid here is that I can create a grid any size I want. This happens to be a 4x4, but I can do whatever size I want. And then I'm literally going to place elements anywhere on that grid that I want with just a couple of lines of CSS. It's really simple and really cool. The last thing we're going to look at on this little page here is like a grid area. Like this can be blocked out for one element right there. Or maybe one element's going to go here, or one element's going to go here. Those are just little grid areas where I can put whatever I want, okay? So with that in mind, here are a couple of things that you can do with the grid. Imagine an invisible grid drawn on here that you can't see it here, but this would be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this particular case grid. This particular piece takes up all 5 of the top row. This one takes up 2 and 1, if you're looking at rows and columns, and so on and so forth. Making a navigation style like this, or a web page like that, with the grid is just a couple of lines of code. It's super easy, okay? Or you can do this kind of thing, which is sort of this mosaic looking thing. Again, this is really easy, and we're going to actually mock both of these up today, okay? That's the big picture overall of what the grid is. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about that? The last thing I want to mention here, this whole thing here, you'll hear it referred to as the grid or the grid container, and then each element inside of it are grid items, okay? So the basic way this works, let's get some code here. So I'll have a div, and we'll call this like class, main content or something. And then inside of there, I'll have some other divs. We'll say a. Okay. something like that. So the way this would work, if I were to apply the grid model on this, this is the grid container, and these would be the elements that I place inside of the grid. Now notice here that I have 5 elements, right? But I have 16 squares, okay? That doesn't matter. These squares are not elements. Those squares are just a random thing in my head that I've invented, or you, the programmer, have invented to help you lay things out. So what I might want to do is say, I want this particular div to take up these blocks right here, and I want this particular div to take up these blocks, and another div to take up that, and so on and so forth. I can just fill it in wherever I want, okay? That's the basic idea. Let's look at some code. All right, so this is very easy to do here. We're going to go over to our CSS. First thing I'm going to do is just put a little bit of basic style on this stuff so we can see it. So div.main content and all the divs inside of there. We'll just put background color is lavender, and font size is like 35 pixels. Width 100%. Height is 200 pixels. And padding, box sizing, border box, padding top, 20 pixels. That prevents the box sizing prevents the padding and the margin and all that to making your box expand. It makes it to where it just, so in other words, when I say I want it to be 200 pixels, yeah, if I didn't have box sizing on, it would now be 240 pixels because it added the padding to it. But since I'm saying I want a border box, and it's going to calculate it for me and keep it at 200 pixels. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to target every other div. So inth child odd, and we're going to make that background color. This will, okay. So none of this is anything new here. All right, this is all stuff we've seen and done before. Let me get that text centered real quick. And semicolon there. 40. Text align center. And let's increase that font size just a teeny bit. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start here. This is just some divs that I've made. Nothing fancy. We haven't done anything with the grid yet, okay? Let's start with that, though. So what I want to do is I want this to be my my grid container. So we're going to target main content, div.main content, and we're going to say display grid. Now, that doesn't do anything other than now we're in grid mode, right? We've done display block, display flex, display inline block, display none. Now we're in grid mode, and now there's an invisible grid there that we in our mind can manipulate positions on that grid, okay? But we need to give it a specific number of columns, and again, we'll never see the grid, we'll just see how the elements are affected by the grid. So here's our first new property, okay? It's called grid template columns, all right? Now let's say I wanted a grid that was 4 by 4. Or there's 4 columns. Don't forget about the rows for a minute. It's 4 columns. And I wanted them to be equally the same amount. 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. That's literally what I type. 25%, 25%, 25%. That one now, just that alone, puts it into grid columns. So what that did, if we go over here, where's my picture? Right here. That basically made this grid right here. And it put the first element there, the second element there, the third one there, the fourth one there, the next one there, and it'll keep going all the way down, okay? That's what we get. Now, when we're looking at this picture, I was showing you the little gaps in between there. I'm going to put those gaps in here so we can have a little clearer picture of each individual element. And so here's another new property. It's called grid column gap. And I want it to be 10 pixels. And so let's look at what that does first. See that little gap I put in there? Okay. Grid row gap. Pixels, 10 pixels. There we go. All right, now, what do we know about properties that have a dash in their name? Yeah, there's probably a shortcut, right? So what do you suppose the shortcut might be to combine column and row there?
You want to do the same, then just for the columns.
Yeah, just grid gap, exactly right, yeah. I think that's what you're saying too, Jared, right? Like that? Yep, we don't even.
Sorry, I was talking about the template. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was talking about this one here. Yep, so there we go, grid gap, and that gives us row and column right there, okay? All right, that's step one. Now, we're familiar with this particular unit of measurement, percentages. We've done that before. Here's a new one that we have not done. Yeah, Chase.
Never mind, I figured it out.
Okay. So here's a new unit of measurement called fractions, okay? And what this is, I'm going to make, well, let me back up just a hair. It doesn't have to be 25, 25, 25, right? I could have said 33, 33, 33. Could have done that, and I'd get something like that, okay? It doesn't even have to be even. I could say 20%, 55%, that's 75, so the last one would be 25%, is that right? Could have been like that, okay? So I can put whatever percentages I want, whatever number of, 1, 2, there's 3 entries there, that's how many columns I'm gonna have, okay? Well, there's another way to do that besides percentages, and this is the more common way when you're dealing with grid, and that is fraction. So 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. What that means is that it's going to be, because I made 3 of those 1 FRs, it's going to be a 3-column grid, and each column will have one equal fraction of the grid, right? It's a pie split exactly into thirds, okay? Like so. But if I wanted to say make this center column twice as big as the other columns, I could do that. Or if I wanted it to be 5 fractions, okay? So think of it this way. So now what's happening here, it's still just 3 columns, but it's taking up a larger percentage of the whole grid, all right? Does that make sense? Okay? Any questions so far? Yeah.
What happens if you just put 33%?
Then you'll have 1 column. Is that what you mean, like this?
Yeah.
You have 1 column that just takes up a third of the page. Yeah. All right. So something I did not know, and one of my students asked the question, and I did not know the answer last class, and turns out it is possible. You can use decimal points here. So I could do like 0.5, 3.5, and 0.5 or something like that. And that works as well. It just depends on what you're trying to calculate, what you're trying to do. It might make sense in certain contexts, but it is allowed. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to one frame, or one fraction, I should say. This time it's going to be 4 columns. They're equally the same size. But what if I wanted 6 columns or 7 or 8 columns, right? To keep typing that over and over again. Okay. Now there are actually 8 columns here, but the other 3 are 1, 2, 3. They're right here. You just can't see them because there's no content, right? We ran out of divs there, but they do exist. Well, rather than having to type that over and over again, there's a really cool function that's part of this whole grid thing called repeat. And so repeat takes in 2 parameters. How many columns do you want? I want 4, and I want them to all be 1 fraction. Okay, I could do that with 8. Could do it with 10, 20, whatever number I want, right? We're going to stick with 4, though. So just those few little things are right there is pretty sweet. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can do here. Right now, I'm just manipulating things. I'm not showing you some layouts yet, but just that alone is pretty powerful. All right, so that's a basic look at the columns. We've only looked at 2 new properties, really. Grid template columns and grid gap, and then this new function here, okay? And that's a new unit of measurement, so 4 new things. All right, feeling all right so far? Okay, let's take a look at rows. So right now, if you've taken 1410 and you've looked at Java Window Builder's little tool for making grid layout, this behaves much like the grid layout. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's okay. But I know Sabbath, you're going through that right now, so this will.
Talking about scene builder?
No, Window Builder in using Eclipse. All right, but the grid flow in there is, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's okay, don't worry about it. But let's take a look at what that means, or what happens here with the rows. Now, if I can do this, I can say grid auto rows, oops, and then I could say I want it to be like 200 pixels, okay? If I do that, then this will force, I'm gonna take these positions off right here. Okay, don't need that anymore. And let's make it 300 pixels. Now it forces the height of each element to be 300 pixels. But what happens if I have some text in here? Let's get some bacon ipsum. I'm just gonna dump it in there. I'm not gonna worry about putting a div around it, or I mean a paragraph around it. Okay. Now if I refresh this page here, look what happens to that text. It's flowing out over the div itself, and it's not, the div didn't resize, right? Now we can deal with that with the overflow. So if I put on here, on all the inner divs, overflow is hidden. That prevents it from overflowing, but we can't see the whole text, okay? So I want that to resize with the text, or I want I want the div to resize with the text. Well, if I take this auto rows out here, let's see what happens if I remove that. There, it resizes it, right? Okay, that's nice. But look at this one here. It's like really skinny and small. I wanted it to be 300, okay? So what we can do, there's a property that we can use called min-max, or not property, but a function, okay? The function's called min-max, and it takes in what you'd think, 2 values, a minimum value and a maximum value. So the minimum value I want any given div to be inside of the container, right? This is the grid container. So any one of my div items that are inside of it, which is all these guys, I want their minimum size to be 300 and their maximum size to be automatic. Now I'm able to keep that size. This grows with the content. This stays at least 300 the way I want it, okay? All right, there's other options though. We can, instead of using grid auto rows, we can actually use grid template rows, right? So I'm gonna get rid of that. Grid template rows. And I can do the same thing where I could say repeat for 1 fraction or something like that. Okay, now notice here this looks like the scroll bar appeared and there's all this blank content down here. What's really happening is there's more rows now, they're just not filled in, okay? So the next thing I could do here, I don't want them to be 1 fraction. Look what happened when they're 1 fraction. This row is this tall, so now this row has to be that tall. And now this row is that tall, and so is this row down here. I don't want that, okay? So instead of saying 1 fraction, I want each of those rows to have a min-max, right? Min-max, 300 pixels, auto. Not too many parentheses there. So again, this repeat takes in 2 parameters. Parameter number 1 is the number of rows, and the second parameter is the size. Well, in this case, the size is another function that takes in 2 parameters, a minimum and a maximum. So now that gets resized. You'll notice my scroll bar is still there because there's another row here that's exactly that 300 pixels right there. It's right, you can't see it, but it's right here. It's about yay big. And there's another one right below that, right? Okay? So if I were to, oops. If I were to change this to just say 2 rows, now we just have 2 rows, and the 2 rows are taking up the viewport there, and there's no more scroll bar. All right? How we feel about all that? Good? Questions? Okay. All right, let's take a look at some other things we can do here. Let's go ahead and let me clear out that text real quick here. Good. And I'm going to add a couple more divs there. F and G. Okay. So now the next thing I want to show you is this. We have the ability to say where a cell starts and where it ends. Okay. So this happens in the children. All right. So let's say I wanted to target this first div right here. How would I target that first div? Yeah, first child or nth child 1, right? So div main content, div first child. And I want that, right now, this is a 4x4 grid, right? What we're gonna do is talk about where the lines are now. That's what we're gonna target. So this is line 1. Well, that's not line 1. That's line 1 right there, right? And this is line 2, so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is say that I want that box to go from line 1 to line 3. See that? Or maybe line 4. Okay? So I can do that. Got to quit bringing that thing up on accident. Okay. Let's go back over here. Are we still running? Yes. Okay. So I can do that by targeting grid, column, start. I want it to start on line 1, grid, column, end. I want it to end on line 3 or line 4. Okay? So now A is going to shoot all the way over to there. And everything else just moves down to the next row. All right? So we feel good about that? Makes sense? Now, what do we know about properties with dashes in their names? There's probably a shortcut. What do you suppose a shortcut would be for this to deal with both the start and end position? Yeah, just grid column. And it would be 1/4. That's how that looks. And there you go. Same thing, okay? You can also do, instead of 1/4, I can say span 3. And that means it'll span 3 columns. Okay, both of those work. If I said span 2, it would only span 2 columns. Okay, both of those properties work. Again, if I wanted to do, I could also say 1/3. That starts at line 1 and goes to line 3. Okay? All right, questions about that basic idea? What? Sure, yeah. Span 3. So keep in mind that when you do span, you're talking about how many columns it will span. When you do it with the number/number, you're talking about from what line to what line, okay? What I'm doing here is just laying out a few possibilities, some just different properties that we're looking at, and then in a minute we're going to bring it all home with some actual examples. These are just me sort of playing around to show you the possibilities, okay? All right, one other thing I want to look at that's kind of fun. Oh, yeah, sorry, Chase.
Can you do it, instead of doing grid column, can you do grid row?
Yes, you can. Yeah, very good.
Grid, or just grid, yeah?
Grid probably exists, just knowing how the hyphenated things work, but I don't know the syntax. But you can do grid row, right? And we're going to look at that in a minute when we make that mosaic, yeah. But you can do grid row. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is, again, the idea here, what I'm doing is I just want to give you some properties. Hold on a second, I'll get you. I just want to give you some properties and some things that we're going to eventually use in a couple minutes when we actually do some real layouts, yeah.
So can you use the span to
For that, you'd want to go like this. You'd want to do like line 3 to line 5 or something like that. Right? All right. Okay. So let me get this back to where it was. We'll go 1/3. There we go. So the next thing I want to show you is inside of here, I'm going to put right inside of this particular div here, C. I'm going to put a few paragraphs with some numbers in it. Oh, what happened there? All right, so now if I refresh this, there's those 4 numbers right there. But I want those to be in grid layout too. So I'm going to put a class on here called like sub content or something like that. And I'm going to put sub content, div.subcontent, display grid. And I'm going to make it grid template columns. I'm just going to make it 50% and 50%. Now that's in grid layout, okay? So the only reason I'm showing you that is to let you know that it exists. You can have nested grids inside of nested grids inside of nested grids as deep as you want to go. I don't know how practical it is to go too many layers deep, but having 1 or 2 could be useful depending on what you're doing, okay? But you see already how just with the, I mean, just this content here is just, you know, style, like color. This has nothing to do with grid. None of this stuff is. So if I took this out for just a second, okay, this is all the grid code. Those few lines of code, we're able to lay stuff out, you know, with a lot of control, okay? Yes, float, easier than float, yeah. Flexbox is still a really good tool, and that's not going anywhere either. And sometimes the right answer is sticking a Flexbox item inside of a grid, right? So there's lots of different ways to do that. All right, I'm going to get rid of that subgrid business, though. I just want to show you that that's possible. And I'm going to get rid of this in here. Go back to where we were. All right, there we go. All right, so let's take a look at alignment, okay? Let's go with this. Let's put this back to normal here. And I'm going to get rid of this line here so that everything's the same size, like that. And I'm going to add one more element so we have an even set of things here. There we go. Okay. Now you may remember in Flexbox, we had keywords like a line item or properties like a line item and justify in these properties. So here we are in the parent again, the Flex container, the grid container. And I'm going to say align items start. Remember that from the Flexbox? What that did was it aligned the items to the beginning where things started, okay? And the whole row actually ends down here somewhere, but it's just aligning them up there to the starting position. You can also do end, right? Okay, and it puts them at the bottom of the row. The default, of course, is stretch, which is what you get automatically, so you don't actually have to type that, so I'm going to leave that alone. There's also, however, justify items. And again, we have the same values, start, so it moves everything over to the start, or I could say to the end. Now I moved everything to the end. Center it. And I could have done that, so if I do both of these, align items center. Now it centers them like dead center in each of the cells inside of the grid, okay? Again, I don't have a specific use case for this, but you might. And this, just knowing it exists is very useful. All right. Now, let's say we had everything displayed like that. Let me put a little bit of padding on these guys here. Let's just make the padding all around 40. There we go. Now it's a little nicer. Okay. So let's say that's the default display we were doing for some strange reason, okay? But what if I wanted just B to not be like that? I can override it, okay? So, and you can do this in Flexbox too. So B is div.mainContent, div nth child 2. Okay, so I'm targeting B right here, and I want to justify self. So justify is left and right, align is up and down. Okay, and if you have a hard time remembering that, think about when you justify text in a Word document, you're justifying it left, right, center, that's justifying the text. So justify is left and right, align is up and down. So I want to justify self to stretch. So now just B is stretching. If I wanted it to also stretch vertically, I would do align self stretch. And now it fills up the whole thing, but the other ones do not. Or maybe you want to do it the other way around. All of them look like B except for one or two look like the other ones. Okay? So you can override inside the child. Now notice here, most of what we're doing is inside the parent. It's inside the grid container. This div is now the grid container because we've applied display grid to it. So it's the div container. This odd thing is only for color purposes, so ignore that. This is the only time we did anything in the child. We did something in the first child a minute ago, but that's it. We're not doing a whole lot in the children. So what's nice about that, all this styling can happen right there in the parent, and it affects everything else, okay? All right, any questions about that? Okay, we're gonna do something cool now. We're gonna actually make something. So first thing I wanna do, I'm clearing all this out. Let me get rid of these properties right here. Oh, I meant to keep the grid gap. Let's put it at 20. There we go, nice. Okay, and I want to change that font color to, where is it? Font color plum. Yeah, like the light purple. Okay. All right, so now we have these 8 cells here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a 12 by 12 grid, okay? So here we go. I can say right here, 12, 12, and I want it to be at least, let's say at least 200 pixels. All right, and I want the max width of the whole grid to be, we'll say 900 pixels, and margin 20 pixels auto. What did I break? What happened? Max width 900 pixels. Did I not save it? Apparently didn't like this. Oh, aha. I should not have put max width. No, that didn't matter. Okay, what's going on here, folks? Where'd all my stuff go? Oh, yeah, sorry. Jeez, I just was scrolled off the screen. Jeez, I'm an idiot. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Okay, sorry about that. That was weird. I had my scroll wheel down here, and I was like scrolling down, not finding anything. All right, so all my code was correct. Okay, now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to change my HTML over here, and we're going to make some semantic markup here. So we're going to make a header. I'm just going to put the word header in there. We're going to make an aside. These are all legitimate tags. Going to make a nav tag, some navigation. Let's do main. This is one we haven't talked about, but this is also a legitimate tag. Main content. Yeah, these are all part of the semantic tags in HTML5. And then we're going to do a section. And we're going to do a footer. Okay, so first thing that's going to happen, there's no style on those, right? Because all my styling is targeting divs. So what's cool here, what I can do, this is another selector we haven't really talked too much about. It's the star selector. But what I'm going to do is say div main content star. So give me everything that is a child of div main content, right? So that's going to make it like that, okay? Does that make sense? So now we're back to where we started. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this padding. Well, we'll leave the padding. All this other stuff, we'll leave it. It's fine. Okay, this odd thing doesn't matter anymore because we're not targeting the divs. So this is where we're at. What I want to do is make something that looks like this, okay? Header, nav, aside, main, section, footer. All right? So let's see if we can figure out how to do that. What did I say it was? It's a 12 by 12 grid, right? It's 12 by 12 grid. Okay. So if it's 12 by 12, and each thing's going to be at least 200 pixels tall, I want to target each of those properties separately. I want to target the header, and I want the header to go column, what is that property called? My brain is locking up on me. What, say it again? Oh my gosh, I can't believe no. My brain is locking up. Oh yeah, did you say grid dash column? Is that what you said? Yeah, sorry, yeah. Column, grid. Sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me today, man. Grid dash column. And I want the header to start at the first line, and where do I want it to end? Almost. 13, right? Yep, 13th line. So just that alone gives me that, okay? That's full size right there. That gives me the header right there, okay? Next, I want the, maybe I want the header. Let's change this to 100 pixels. Yeah. So I think the header's good there. Now what I want to do is that same thing with nav and aside. Now notice my HTML here. Aside comes before nav. That doesn't even matter because I can position these anywhere on the grid I want. Okay, so let's do that. So now I'm going to target the nav, or the navy, and I want it to start on grid column 1, right? Because it's still starting on the edge right here. This is grid line 1, okay? I want it to go to maybe like 4, okay? So it's going to go to 4, but I want to also do grid row. Now grid row, where is it going to be on the grid row?
3 and 4.
It's going to start at, so this is line 1 right here. That's line 2. So it's going to start at 3, and it's going to go down to like 5 or 6 or something like that, right? Let's just try 3/6. And there's navigation. Now these guys are in the way here, and oh, I should have started at 2. There we go. And that's going too far, I think. Navigation's going down too far. So let's make it go to like 4. That's good for now. Okay, we'll tweak it in a minute. Now I want to put the aside right below it. Well, the aside is going to be very similar to this. Right? It's going to still go 1-4 for the column, but it's going to start where nav ended. Nav ended at 4, and it's going to go to 6, like so. Okay? Now you may be wondering, why are they different sizes? When we're done, they'll all be the right size. What's happening here, though, is because these other guys are still in the row, it's expanding the size of that row, right? Since there's nothing next to a side, it's not expanding, okay? So 2, 4, 4, 6. Let's take a look at, we want to put main in there. So now main wants to start where nav or aside ends. So if I'm going to do main, let's just move it up here. And now I'm just targeting these tags directly, right? So grid column, it's going to start on the line that nav ended on, which is 4. And it's going to go all the way to the end, which is 13. Okay, it's also going to start where nav started as far as rows go, and it's going to end where aside ended. That make sense? So it's going to go from 2 to 6, if I remember right. So it's going to go from 2 to 6. Let me put that in there, and then we'll talk about this. Row 2, 6. Okay? See, now that nav is the right size, okay? We're almost done. We just have to put the section in the footer, and we're done, right? Now, I want to pause here for a minute, though, and discuss what we're seeing here. This is where, that's part where I say the grid is only in your mind, right? I'm having to look at these numbers here, and I'm trying to apply where the heck they are on this positioning, right? It's all in my head. There's no real grid. It's just it's a design concept that helps us lay things out. But there's no actual grid anywhere. All right, so section now, we know section needs to start where a side ends. Well, it needs to start on 1, right? Section, and for the columns, grid column, it's going to go from 1 to 13. We already know that. But the grid row, it's going to go from wherever a side ended. Where did the side end? It ended at 6, and it's going to go to, I don't know, like 8. Just making stuff up here. Okay? And there we go. There's our section. Okay? Now let's do the footer. And it's going to be grid column, and it's going to go 1 to 13, and the grid row, it's going to start where section stopped, 8, and let's make it go all the way to 12, or all the way to 13 if we want. Maybe this 12 by 12 is too big, okay? Let's do that, and now we have this ginormous footer down here, okay? So maybe a 12 by 12 is too big, right? But that's it. Just styling these individually here. So again, this is one of the few times that we've actually targeted the children. But styling these individually, we're able to come up with this kind of a layout here. Obviously, it would have real content in it. And again, if I wanted to, in my CSS here, I can make the max width, you know, whatever, 1500. Make it whatever size I want. Okay, that was just, I just chose that particular size. Okay? All right, how do we feel about that? Pretty good? Yeah.
You select, or when you put grid column,
Yep.
dash column, can you put column? Or does it have to be grid dash column?
Grid dash column.
Okay.
Yeah, there's probably, grid is probably, I'm sure grid is a thing, and it somehow combines row and column numbers. I just don't know how to use it, but I'm sure that's a thing. All right. So you'll find typically when you have those dash properties, you can always, you can chop things off, but you can never chop off the first word usually. Okay, any questions about this? All right, let me answer those questions on the recording here. So the question was about this spacing here. That's just because I just said that its width is 1500, and then why it's centered is because I said I did this line right here, right? And then Jared's question was about responsiveness. And so you can see as I resize here, it's pretty responsive for the most part, okay? But one of the problems you'll have is you'll need to deal with this text here and make it the right size and this kind of stuff. So you still have to do some stuff in there. But overall, it is pretty responsive. The grid is responsive for the most part. Now, the other thing, though, you may want to, right about here, you want to move that navigation to the top, move the aside to the top, right? You can do that. Just in your media query, change these values right here, right? So you can totally do that as well. And so it just depends on, like, for example, on my side, I know you guys are probably tired of looking at the site, but, so right here, this stuff on the right here, when I get too small, that stuff moves down to the very bottom right here. This is not using the grid, by the way, this is using Flexbox. But with the grid, you could do the same type of thing, just manually position that wherever you want it with the different size. So when this gets too small, we can say, all right, that's about where I want the navigation to go. So what would I do? Well, I would change main content to go from 1 to 13, right, in my media query. In fact, let's just do that. Well, if I do it, I'm gonna have to change all of this, I think. No, we should be okay. Yeah, this is fine. Let's just do it real quick. So let's go at media and max width of, I don't know, 700 pixels, something like that. And we'll say main is going to go from 1 to 13. So grid column 1 to 13. And then we want navigation to also go 1 to 13 and aside. So we're going to do all of those and nav. All of those are going to go from 1 to 13. But then we want nav to, we can keep nav where it's at. We want main content to go down to where nav will end.
Do you want to go down to where a side will end?
Well, 'cause we're going to put main between nav and aside.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right, if we wanted to put a side on top. But I was thinking that if the page was this small, we probably wouldn't care about a side as much. So right now, nav's going to go across the whole page. Main content, we want to bump it down to here. So right now, where nav it happens to end is 4. So we want main to go grid row 4. And currently, what's it do? It goes from 2 to 6. We're going to say that it goes from 4 to 8. See, this is going to screw up everything else, right? It's going to throw off all the other things. But we'll just play around. Let's just see what that looks like right now. Maybe my media query is not right. There we go. Okay. So this looks okay. We still need to do some tweaking here, right? My aside's completely missing now because I need to explicitly declare the position. So I don't want to bother too much with that, tweaking all that stuff, because it's a little bit of a pain, but that's the idea, right? With the media query, you just go in and tweak all the settings. So this is where mobile first comes in handy. You lay out the mobile first, and then you do the grid, and then as you grow it, you change things a little bit, and it's not as messy in this particular case. All right, any other questions about that? Let's take a look at the Mosaic here. Let's see if we can knock that out real quick. And then I'm going to show you grid areas, which is one of the coolest things. All right, let's try to take a look at this Mosaic now. I'm going to clear all this crap out of here. And I'm going to copy and paste this and put it aside for a minute. We're going to use this in a minute again, but so I don't want to lose it. But for now, we're going to go back to these divs of just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Okay. And I think, so this is good. Let's just take a look at what it looks like at the moment. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's change this to a 9x9. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is hit the odds again. Div main content, div nth child, odd, background color, this'll. All right, there we go. Okay, so let's try to make this Mosaic here, which is right there. This guy right here on the left. Okay. So think of this as a 9x9 grid, even though it doesn't look like it on the page here. This were a 9x9 grid. This is probably like 1 through 4, and this is like 5 through 10. That seemed about right. So let's just start there. So I'm going to target down here. Let's go ahead and put in our stuff here. main content, div, nth child 1. Whoa, what just happened? Okay, I'm going to target each of those individually. There's 2, there's 3, there's 4, and there's 5. Okay? So nth child 1, we're going to call this blue one 1 here. And I'm thinking that the columns are going to go from 1 to like 4. Okay? So we're going to go with grid column 1 to 4. And I'm thinking that the grid row is going to go from 1 to like 6. Okay? 1 to 6. All right, that's good enough for that. We don't want to look at it now because it'll just be a mess, right? So we're just going to do it all and see how it turns out. So that's the first one. Let's look at the second one. We're going to say that that one goes from 4, grid column, 4 to the end, 10. And it is only going to go from 1 to 3. Grid row 1 to 3. Sounds good to me. Okay, the center one here, it's going to go from 3 down to whatever we said this was, I think 6. So we're going to say grid row is going to go from 3 to 6, and then grid column is going to go from wherever this first one went, which was 4, and it's going to go not quite to the end. We'll say like 7. Everybody follow what I'm doing there? Okay. And I'm going to call 4 this yellow one. So 4 needs to go at the bottom of these two, which they both go to 6. Yeah. So grid row 6 to 10. Okay, that's all the way to the bottom. And then it needs to go from 1 over to whatever this one goes to the end of. So it's a 7. So it's going to go grid column 1 to 7. Oh, thanks. Okay. Last but not least, number 5 here. And again, I could have done whatever order I wanted. It doesn't matter. Okay. As long as, so let me finish that and I'll explain what I mean. So this needs to go from the bottom of this, which we called number 2. So number 2 started at 3, or ended at 3, I should say. So we're going to say grid row 3 to 10. And then it needs to go, the column I'm looking at here is wherever this one ended, which was 7. So grid column 7, and it needs to go to 10. I think that's right. We're about to find out. You ready? Bam, nailed it. Okay? Not bad, right? Now, I looking at this, I'd probably want to extend 1 and 3 by 1 more line and drop 4 by 1 line. So let's look at that real quick. I said extend 1 and 3 by 1 line. So we're going to put them to 7 and 7. And then I said shorten 4 by 1 line. So 7. There. That's closer to what I was looking for. Okay? And we could tweak it and make it more perfect, right, the way we want it. But that's the basic idea. And I mean, we styled that whole thing without even looking, right? It's because the grid is all in your head. It's literally all in your head, okay? But that was all we did. Now, what I wanted to show you here is this. I just happened to randomly decide to apply this style to the first child. It doesn't matter. As long as all 5 of these exist, it doesn't matter which child I put them on, right? So I can make this one the third child. We'll make that one the first, make that one the 5th, that one the 2nd, and what's missing, 4th? It doesn't matter. Those 4 blocks are going to be put in those 5 positions, or those 5 positions, 5 blocks, 5 positions. It changed it because of the colors, but that's all, okay? All right, how we feel about all that? Pretty sweet? This is a nice thing. Now, what's cool about this particular one, I saw somebody do this online the other day. It was pretty cool. Let me see if I can do it real quick here. So I'm going to make this a square, or, well, let's see. Each one's 100, so that's 900. So I'm going to go 900 this way. That should make it a square. That doesn't look like a square. Let me change my grid gap to like 5 pixels. And we'll make this like 1,000. Does that look like a square? That's pretty close. Okay, it's close enough. Let me go back and put these back to the order I had so we have the coloring I liked. Okay, so let's look at that. Okay, there we go. Now, this is just a fun little effect you can do. And you guys are familiar with this property already, but we have the transform property, and we're going to rotate on the Z 45 degrees, I think was what we did. And we're going to scale it to 0.7. And transform, I spelled it wrong. Come on, what's going on here? Transform. There. Get this cool looking thing, right? So I don't know a use case for that, but that's cool. Okay? So that whole thing, I just rotated the whole grid. Just rotated it by 45 degrees. Okay? We could also just cut this out of here, and when I hover over the grid, again, this is just me being silly at this point, but and we'll get rid of that scale. Now when I hover over the grid, the whole thing rotates, right? Put a transition on it. And let's go ahead and shrink it up already. Transform scale. I like that 0.07, that 0.7. Okay, so what I've done here is I've made the scale by default 70%. I put a transition on it, so when I hover over it, I get a nice little effect here, right? Where it grows to 100% and it rotates, okay? And if I want to leave it at scale 0.7, we get that effect. Right. Anyway, silliness, but it's there. Just thought I'd show it to you. Okay, this next thing is by far the coolest part about the grid. Okay, it's called grid areas, all right? So here's what we're gonna do. In the code, all this hard work we just did, it's gone. Okay, I'm gonna kill it to right here. And I'm gonna get rid of this stuff. I think we're good there. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, okay. And we're gonna copy this back in so we can change our HTML. Okay, we're back to that. Oh, let me get that effect off of there. There we go. Okay, there we go. We're back to this. Okay, now what I can do here, I'm gonna make this grid, let's make it 5 by 5, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that looks good. And we'll make the max width 1500. There we go. All right, I'm gonna remake this one right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 6 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so we're gonna make it a 6 by 6 grid. Okay, but I'm gonna do it using grid areas. This is super cool. All right, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm going to target each of these individual tags right here, okay? So header, and let's do side, footer, nav, section, main. I think that's all of them. Side, footer, section, nav, main, and I should have put this in here first. So each one of those I'm gonna call the grid area property. All right, let me go ahead and put that in there real quick. Okay, and all we have to do is give it a name. We can give it whatever name we want, right? So, I mean, literally whatever name you want. So I'm gonna call header Beavis, okay? I'm gonna call aside, and I'm gonna call the rest of them a normal name. But I just put Beavis here to prove the point. They can be called whatever you want. Section, it's a good enough name. And navigation, oops, forgot the semicolon. And then grid area, for main, we'll call main, all right? So now that I've assigned these, each their own grid area name, I can now, with a very visual way of writing code, lay this out how I want, okay? And so here's how it goes. In the main area right here, in the main content, the grid container, I'm going to say grid template area. And then in quotes, I'm going to put, now this is a six columns, right? Okay, I'm going to put the word Beavis 6 times. Beavis, 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 and Beavis. Because that's the name of the header. That's the name I gave it. What that means is I'm going to have, in 6 spots, header, 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 header. Okay? Next line. I can do, let's say I want the navigation, or what is it? Let's look at it. Navigation. So I want navigation, and then I want main. Can you dig? See what I'm doing there? It's pretty sweet. So now I want the next one to be aside. Actually, I want navigation. Well, let's leave it with aside. We'll go with aside, main. Okay, again, I'm typing 6 things there. Then below that, I want section. I'm just going to copy paste at this point. Oops. And then I want footer. And the only reason I'm using footer in sections because that's what I named the grid area down here. If I call this something else, I'd have to be putting that something else there. Don't forget the semicolon at the end. And this should give us, nope. Make sure, grid template. Oh, I think it's supposed to be areas. Yeah, that's the mistake I made in my last class. I forgot the S, okay? So there we go. That's what we got. Now, what's cool about this, I can actually, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I still have a 6th row there. Maybe I want navigation to take up 2 sections. So I just copy that line there. And now navigation takes up a little bit more space. Maybe I want that aside to take up double the amount. Now it takes up more space. Okay? Maybe I want the header to take up more, like 3. So now it does. You can look at this and you're visually looking at what the grid looks like. Okay? That make sense? That's a pretty sweet way to design something. If you can envision it in your head by drawing this on a piece of paper, then you just write the words in. And if I realize, oh, I want that navigation to move into that main content a little bit more, I want a side. First of all, I need some more rows here. There we go. I want that aside to be bigger. I want the navigation to be bigger, but I want the main to actually be navigation, and then aside. Still have 6 columns. What did I do? Oh, I meant to, yeah, that was an accident. That should have been over here. There we go. That's what I have to do. There we go. Okay? Yeah,
Go back to the syntax and how you named everything.
grid area. And again, a better name for this would be header, obviously, right? And then I would just replace all of those with header. Yeah, if you use single letters, then they would line up. That's a good idea, yeah. Then I'm gonna delete these two. And duplicate that, and so now it's better, okay? All right, any questions? That's an introduction to grid. It's up to you now to go and play. The world is your oyster, as they say, right? There's so much stuff you can do with grid, tons of cool things. But I think particularly those of you who have a design, eye, which I don't have, I think you can see the potential and the power of this and how easy it is to lay out a website. Just keep in mind, it's not 100% browser supported. All the major browsers support it. I think even IE is on board at this point, but there's still a couple that have some issues with it. Okay? Any questions? Going once?